Today we're just going to continue doing what we did yesterday with four different panelists. The first one we're going to have is David Tamez, and he's going to talk to us about social agency, social cognition in legal cases, particularly of the judges, and the use of AI.
Thank you, Syed, and thank you all for being here for the second day. My talk is titled Law, Social Cognition, and Artificial Intelligence. It's in part taken from an article or a chapter that the late Frederick Schauer wrote on law and social cognition, which basically gave an outline or overview of the ways that law and legal institutes impact our social cognition. In part, what we all may recognize by this point, that law and legal institutions operate under a certain understanding of human rationality. Most of the times laws are written with the belief that people are maximizers of their preferences, and that can have, as behavioral economists have shown, this can have a significant impact and often fall short of the intention of laws because people aren't always maximizers of their preferences, or they're not always rational in those ways. In fact, we have what these behavioral economists call embedded cognitive quirks. Our decisions are also noisy, and judges and juries, judges in particular, are no exception to this rule that decisions are noisy, especially in such cases involving where they have to provide a sentencing decision. So this is kind of in light of that work, in light of the comments and overview of that Frederick Schauer provides, I thought I contributed a little bit to that by talking about the ways that artificial intelligence might impact that, specifically how it might negatively impact some of these social cognitive endeavors that law and legal institutes and legal agents engage in. So first, a bit of a warning, a few warnings. You're going to hear the word social a lot in this talk, and I kind of more or less apologize for that, but you'll see why I'm going to mention that and emphasize that throughout this talk. In this presentation, like maybe some of the other talks we might hear, is kind of more in progress than maybe a piece of work, although I'm taking a few of the things that I've been working on in other areas, kind of applying it to this topic here. And then some of the concepts I introduce here are still in much need of fleshing out and refinement, or perhaps even abandonment. So perhaps more than others here that have been given talks or will be given talks today, I will greatly benefit from your comments and feedback to help refine some of those ideas. So I take myself as making more or less two sorts of claims here. The first one I take to be somewhat uncontroversial, although there may be some discussion about that. But the first claim is just that programs and tools under the umbrella of artificial intelligence can significantly impact our epistemic environments in ways that ought to be concerning. So again, I'll provide some motivation for that claim and show some examples. But I take that to be rather clear that AI is starting to have or starting to show how it might impact our epistemic environments and how these impacts can negatively sort of interfere with our development as epistemic agents. Claim two, which I take to be somewhat more controversial, but maybe have some sympathetic ears in this workshop. To best identify solutions or fruitful interventions to solve these problems, we must provide a social rather than just merely individualistic assessments, appealing here to the idea that maybe social epistemological view or approach is a better way to frame these issues and a better way of going about and determining what sort of ways can we respond to the ways that AI is impacting our epistemic environments. In both cases, I will focus primarily on the impacts made on us as legal agents and our legal cognition. So again, I'll appeal to judges and some of their work and some of the things that they have to deal with. Before I get right into the substance of these claims, I want to mention briefly the fear that I'm responding to here is that I don't want to be taken as saying that AI is novel or unique in the sense that it's maybe the only technology that has had any impact on our legal and social cognition. I in no way am under that belief. And just to kind of show that, there are two examples that I have in mind. And one is pretty straightforward. The other one may be a bit of a reach, but happy to discuss that more, or the reason for including it here. The obvious one is photography. Photography, when it was first introduced and was being developed and folks were getting used to engaging in photography, it caused the courts and society to think critically about notions of privacy and the right to privacy and how to protect it. So you had early on what might be paparazzi-like activities where private citizens were being photographed in traditionally private settings. And so that caused Warren and Brandeis to write an article discussing the potential ways that law could respond to these endeavors by sort of codifying some sort of right to privacy. Their notion was to entail the right to be let alone, and that obviously, as the years have gone, new challenges to our privacy, that definition has had to be worked on. And then you have the introduction of digital photography and digital artifacts. And this is, again, broad strokes. There's some finer details that one could flesh out here. But digital artifacts, when they were first introduced as sort of evidentiary artifacts, courts at first required a heightened sense of scrutiny for these digital artifacts, given how easily they could be manipulated. So you had things like Photoshop. But eventually, this heightened scrutiny went away, and courts found a way to more or less adapt to these changes. And again, this is what I take to be a stretch. Video games, using the likeness and name of athletes, especially college athletes, required the NCAA and society generally to rethink the amateur status of college players. So they were no longer thought of as amateur in the traditional ways because they were generating money, they were generating these opportunities. So you had that NCAA versus Alston, which led to NIL benefits, name, image, likeness. And arguably, and this is sort of one of the things that I'm exploring on the side here, that these NIL or this NIL framework might be able to be used in some way regarding the non-consensual use of a person's likeness in AI-generated content. I'll talk about a little bit about what those might be. That's kind of honorable mention and things that could be discussed in other ways, thinking about the history of technology and its impact on our social cognition or legal cognition. But I want to start with the first claim and specifically this idea of epistemic environments. What do I mean by epistemic environments? And I'll get to the idea that this is not necessarily a new idea, but I want to kind of flesh it out a little bit more. So going back to Aristotle, and this might be more or less a botched picture of what Aristotle talked about here, but the general idea is that one, Aristotle believed, and the early Greeks and later medieval ages believed that a goal of politics and of governments was to produce a system of laws that enabled its citizens to be virtuous. He believed this in part because the environment one inhabited has a significant impact on how we develop as knowers and as actors. The unhealthier an agent's environment, the less likely she is to develop as a virtuous person. So again, the upshot there is that an impact on our epistemic environments will have an impact on how we develop as deliberators, as reasoners, as knowers. And arguably, this applies to our attempts to be lawful agents or as skillful legal cognizers, such as judges, and as members of a jury. So basically, impact on our epistemic environments will have an impact on our own epistemic development. And so, like I said, I don't necessarily take this to be a new concept. This epistemic environments have been referred to in maybe in passing or in brief references. Some of the more fleshed out definitions I've seen of this that maybe refer to epistemic infrastructures. So this is from the digital humanities. You have speak of these infrastructures that do important boundary work for students and researchers. They define what kinds of knowledges and experiences are legitimate, what kinds are worthy or consideration in a discipline and which are not. In recent literature regarding public policy, epistemic infrastructures are referred to these mixed materials, practices, and meanings that comprise interlinked knowledge structures and generating effects on structuring social relations. But despite this sort of use of epistemic infrastructures, I still like the idea of or the term epistemic environments or prefer that to infrastructures for these reasons. Infrastructure implies something that was built or developed with some kind of intention. So we might think of universities, bodies of government, courtrooms, or scientific labs as being representative of epistemic infrastructures because there are these formal rules about fact-finding, about how they go about doing their business. Environments, however, can be seen as consisting of both intentional and unintentional epistemic endeavors. So we might think about the spontaneous running into a neighbor to gossip as being an unintentional or unstructured form. There aren't any formal rules to gossip. So when you run into a neighbor to talk about maybe other neighbors, there aren't really any sort of stated ways we're supposed to go about doing this, although there might be implied or common norms that are followed, like maybe tea or cocktails must be present at such times. Trying to prevent myself from saying something like natural, but I think something like spontaneous or unplanned is maybe better. Again, and in Flaherty, in the Fourth Revolution, his book in Fourth Revolution talks about, human beings are to be thought now in the information age. as a type of what he calls inforgs. So information beings mutually connected and embedded in an informational environment, which he calls the infosphere, which we share with informational agents with natural and artificial that also process information logically and autonomously. I'm not necessarily using that as a definition for environments, but it's just another appeal to information or epistemic environment. So now I want to kind of get to how I think AI might impact our epistemic environments. And I think there are at least three types of AI ML programs that impact our various epistemic environments. There might be more, so I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but I think these three cover quite a bit because like there are various types of iterations of these three tools. So the first one, so deepfakes and AI generated images, algorithmic governance tools, and automated surveillance. So I kind of get into a little bit. So start off with deepfakes and AI generated images. So this is a quote from Regina Rini from, I believe it's Epistemic Backstops and Deepfakes, or something to that effect. But in terms of deepfakes impacts on our epistemic environments, Rini states that video and audio recordings function as epistemic backstops. They regulate our testimonial practices, sometimes bluntly, though more often subtly. The availability of recordings undergirds the norms of testimonial practice, increasing the incentive for testifiers to speak with sincerity and competence. So this is kind of speaking to how important videos and images and audio are fact-finding endeavors, are epistemic endeavors. So when someone provides a testimony of something happening, of an event happening, they'll often maybe, especially today with everyone having an iPhone, provide some form of video to demonstrate, like, this is where I got this from. This video demonstrates what I'm talking about. And that is meant to provide sort of validating proof that what this person is saying is actually the case. Deepfakes challenge this norm by sort of providing ways for people to distort images, distort actual events, distort videos of actual events, and also just in other cases, as these technologies are developing, create new events from near whole cloth. So usually in the first generations of deepfakes, you had to take somebody, or AI generated images, you had to take somebody's image and then make something of it. Now you can just make just about anything or any sort of scene using AI generation tools. So I apologize if you're on this Zoom call and you're Catholic. I was also raised Catholic, so this is not meant to be in any way sort of blasphemous or against the Pope here, but just kind of a common example of a deepfake is of the Pope in some sort of garb that he would not otherwise be in. So some other more concerning uses of deepfakes include this sort of robocall that some of you may be aware of that was used this year in New Hampshire's primary. And this is basically a robocall of someone sounding like Joe Biden, telling people not to vote in the primary.
We know the value of voting Democratic when our votes count. It's important that you save your vote for the November election. We'll need your help in electing Democrats up and down the ticket. Voting this Tuesday only enables the Republicans in their quest to elect.
Okay, you get the idea. This deepfake audio call or audio Joe Biden was trying to serve as a sort of informational, telling people not to vote in the primary. This mattered because at New Hampshire at the time, Joe Biden was not on the ticket for clerical procedural reasons. And so basically everyone needed, if they were going to vote for Biden, they needed to write his name in. And this robocall was telling people to not go and vote, to save their vote for November, which would have been more or less damaging to the Biden campaign at the time. A computer science student, I think, was asking Putin a question. And to ask him the question, he asked it as a deepfake of Putin.
Владимир Владимирович, здравствуйте. Я студент и учусь в Санкт-Петербургском государственном университете. Хочу спросить, правда ли, что у вас много двойников? И еще, как вы относитесь к тем опасностям, которые несет в нашу жизнь искусственный интеллект?
So you get a sense there that you kind of saw Putin's initial reaction to when he realized that the person that was raising the question was him, or some version of him, and he was quite surprised and taken aback by it. I am curious as to what that student is up to now, given this sort of bold move to appear as Putin. So again, these are just examples of ways that deepfakes might sort of pollute our epistemic environments with very compelling, very believable audio and video and imagery that may cause people to be heighten their skepticism about digital artifacts. It will lead to potentially what Chesney and Citron in their paper, in one of the, I think, first papers that outlined the potential impacts of deepfakes, they introduced this idea of the liar's dividend. So they say, as the public becomes more aware of the idea that video and audio can be convincingly faked, some will try to escape accountability for their actions by denouncing authentic video and audio as deepfakes. Put simply, a skeptical public will be primed to doubt the authenticity of real audio and video evidence. The skepticism can be invoked as well as against adulterated content. So basically what they're saying there is that the mere existence of deepfakes will not only cause us to create instances of audio of fake testimony, but it'll cause us to be skeptical of actual testimony. So this skepticism, they argue, can be invoked just as well against authentic as against adulterated content, hence the liar's dividend. So the liar's dividend is just this idea that nefarious actors can benefit by referring to actual evidence of an event in the form of audio or video as an instance of deepfake. So I forgot to include this in the slides, but one example, early example of this is Elon Musk utilized, or his team utilized, this sort of defense in court where he was being sued for a so-called automated vehicle going awry. And the person suing him was trying to argue that in various outings, Elon had spoken much of the safety of these automated vehicles, and was trying to use that against him to say that actually they're not that safe. And in fact, there's negligence that can be taken from the insistence that they are. Elon Musk's team argued that the videos of instances of Elon talking about the safety of these automated vehicles were fake, when in fact they were not fake, they were real. So it's kind of this trying to draw or trying to create this doubt within the courtroom about this evidence against Elon Musk. Moving forward, so I'll kind of rush through these a little bit, going through algorithmic governance. So as we know, with the specific case of judges, the use of RAIs, risk assessment instruments, Syed and I, in another paper of ours, refer to them as risk assessment tools, giving it the acronym of RAT, but it seems like most people want to refer to them as RAIs. And in there, we kind of talk about the epistemic abilities of judges, how those might be impacted by the continual use and trust in risk assessment instruments. And just to kind of, in analogous studies regarding chatbots, these studies appear to validate these concerns because this study shows that there's some cognitive decline that can be measured after continual use of chatbots to do certain tasks. Briefly, automated surveillance is sort of the idea of social dignity. In a case involving Salta, Argentina, they used a tool made by Microsoft, intelligent algorithms to identify characteristics in people that can lead to some of these problems and warn the government so that they can work on prevention. So the problem that they were trying to address was teenage pregnancy and therefore school dropouts, so that they can find ways to intervene and prevent cases of teenage pregnancy and school dropouts. In some cases, this algorithm misidentified or basically act as minority reports, precogs that identified students prior to any sort of actual pregnancy taking place. And so this affected not only the privacy, but also their autonomy in generating a wide potential for discrimination. So these surveillance could cause us to view people that are identified by these programs in a particular way. So it changes the way that we think about them, the way that we view them. So it may cause distrust and so on and so forth. And this could be problematic. This final point, why a social epistemological approach? Arguably, we can say that knowledge is socially situated. We're not just sort of one-to-one sort of instances in the ways that we gather information. We exist within a type of environment, a type of framework. That is, what one knows depends on one's social location, and what knowledge circulates within a community depends on the social structures, practices, institutions, and political economies, so on and so forth. Further, whether the testimony of others can be taken by the consumer hearer as knowledge depends on whether the producer came by their belief via reliable processes and not on the reliability of the hearer's own cognitive abilities and processes. So in other words, we had to judge not only our own abilities, but we had to judge the ways that others came about their information. Hence, to better understand and respond to the concerning impact of AI on our epistemic environments, a social and not rather just individualistic approach is required. Thank you.
Thanks for that talk. Lots of risks there. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the benefits. So one of the things that I have been thinking about is chatbots answering questions, either when you do a Google search or just interact directly with it on your phone, right? Of course, they're notoriously unreliable about some things, but about other things, they're pretty good. So you might think that in a low stakes context, for an educated user who's aware of the kinds of things the chatbots tend to do well or poorly, you might say, hey, this is a substantial improvement of our epistemic environment. So yeah, so we need to all be aware of risks, and that's tended to be the emphasis in the pieces of the literature I've seen on this. But I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on, on the upsides.
Yeah, no, I think that's a point well taken. And I do agree. So using the specific example of, say, judges, it's although a high risk situation, we might say, and I don't want to sort of dissuade the general use of risk assessment instruments by judges, because it could, if used in the right way, in a maybe say wise way, these tools can allow judges to sort of move through cases at a quicker pace. It could sort of save other sort of resources that they usually have to use up when they're trying to take their time with certain cases. And so in other ways, it could be used to sort of correct some of our poor reasoning. So one way that the use of RAIs is defended in some of the literature is that it could act as a sort of correctional tool, like the analogy that's used is how our side mirrors on cars, how today they have that sort of warning that if you're trying to move over and there's a car over. The same sort of thing is argued about the use of RAIs, is that they can kind of warn the judge about, hey, you may not be, like, if you're thinking that you should do a harsh or judge this person to be a high risk. The tool is actually judging them to be a low risk. So maybe you need to adjust your reasoning, or just adjust what you're looking at to make your determination. So in those ways, it could be correctional. But again, it depends on the judge being more or less critical or mindful of how they're using these tools. And so, yeah, in that ways, it could be a positive. Yeah, I just talked about the risks. I think there are plenty of ways that some of these tools can work as enhancers. A friend and a former peer of ours, Ramon Alvarado, talks about how some of these tools can be seen as epistemic tools, and it can actually enhance the ways that we come to know things. So yeah, perfectly reasonable to also think of them as being helpful in ways.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I have to admit that I sort of share the focus on the risks. I would even go a little bit further, say that with the increasing indistinguishability, especially with machine-generated text, we sort of risk an epistemological crisis if we want to use the internet still as a knowledge acquisition tool. Because if we cannot distinguish whether we can, as educated users of AI tools, like Eric might be one, think that this text is something where I sort of have my reservations because of the unreliability and stuff like that. And this text, I don't need to have my reservations because it is really authored by this person, and this person has a long publication list and had a lot of good arguments already. So having said that, I think the objection of Eric is really interesting, and so I ask you, what do you think if we use those tools as inspiration, so more in a creative thing? So if you a componist, if you just have a bad day and nothing goes, you take it as a muse. Or if I have a day where I think I cannot write an English sentence, I just take it as a muse and it's giving me an inspiration. So what do you think about this kind of positive use, which is not leading to cognitive atrophy in my place? It's rather sort of helping me out if my brain is too tired to do something.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly well taken. That yeah, I think it could be, and I think it is used by some artists, because I have this photographer friend that sometimes uses the what's the one AI generating tool, I forget the name of it, but
Dreamweaver.
Dreamweaver, yeah, I think that might be it. That they use it to sort of provide inspiration for possible ways that he could of possible photographs that he could take, and ways that he might maybe position a certain photo shoot or things like that. And so so in this scenario, he's using it as a way to sort of improve his creativity in the actual photo taking endeavors of his job. And so yeah, I think it could lead to some inspiration when people are kind of maybe burn out but they need to get something done. Like say some of us are having to write grants from time to time. And I think ChatGPT can, when we're kind of slogging through and having to create that narrative for a grant, and which cannot be is sometimes not very fun to do. ChatGPT can kind of help us think of or get started in a way. We might not use the actual text that it generates, but it might help us get started. It's like, okay, maybe this is how I can frame this narrative. This is how I can frame or things that I can discuss in this grant. So I think in those ways, again, I guess the biggest sort of or the word that's doing a lot of weight here is using it the right way, using it in a wise way. What that entails and how we go about in doing that, I think depends again on how we think about our development as epistemic agents, and to ensure that, like, even when we use it, we're still remaining critical, we're still remaining sort of skeptical about or sort of mindful of how it impacts us. So I'm not, I don't want to be sort of or the person that says that we should not use AI tools at all, but we should just be cautious and critical in the ways that we do.
So that means that you think that the doses is very important to think about. So would you be one of the persons saying don't use it daily, and then the risks are getting low?
In that, I think in terms of developing atrophy, maybe, but I think the risks around the other. So one thing I didn't mention, especially regarding the use of maybe deepfake or AI generating tools or image content generation, it can sometimes make it seem that doing bad things or potentially illegal things seem easy. So like if you know that you can just use a tool to sort of use somebody's likeness and there's very little chance of you getting caught, and you see that others around you are using it quite regularly, maybe not for money generating purposes, but for other purposes, that may cause you to think that that it's not, that what you're doing is somewhat okay or okay enough because it's easy to do and there are others around you doing it. So the analogy that comes to my mind is when we're all, I don't know if anybody else has this shared experience, but when I first started driving, or when I started learning to when I finally got on the road, one thing that you initially realize is that no one is going by the speed limit, at least in the US. And so that sort of causes you to, it's like, well, if no one else is doing it around me, then I will maybe observe the law less than I was initially told when I was being taught. And I think a similar case is when people are using these tools, is that the ease of doing so. So there's an example of I think a mom of a cheerleader who used deepfakes to make I guess competitor girls look like they were doing something bad at school, and she shared this, and so these girls got harassed. But the ease of using these tools can maybe sometimes lead us to doing very bad things. So if I'm anything, I'm the person saying be careful, slow down a little bit, and think critically about how we use these tools and what we use them for. And maybe we think about socially how best to introduce these tools, how best to maybe model the use of these tools, so that maybe people will learn by example, because we don't always learn by just being told to do something, but we must learn from our peers about the norms governing the use of these tools, or the norms generally around us. So I think the response is not so much about legislation, but also we must think about the norms that we introduce.
Okay, so there's a question from Lawrence Whitney. They say, how do you evaluate overly positive public perceptions of AIs and their outputs? For example, a juror or a judge who thinks AIs are more intelligent than humans, and so evidence or the evaluation of evidence that are outputs from AIs might be taken to be more reliable. This could impact how a judge evaluates whether or not probable cause exists for a search warrant, for example, where there is in fact too little evidence to justify one, but the investigator ran the evidence through a machine learning algorithm, and it indicated that the evidence pointed to a particular subject. My question is thus about how our epistemic environment impacts our interpretations of AI.
Yeah, so the early studies about public perception of ML tools, at least in the case of judicial decision making about sentencing, appears to show that people aren't yet convinced about these tools. So there's currently a negative perception of these tools. So in that way, jurors, if they're sort of asked to assess the findings of the ML tool, they might think less of it at the moment. But this could change, and it depends again on our messaging about these tools, how they're introduced into our society. If judges are taught, for example, to trust these tools, or just sort of, and so this is one area that I'm also looking at is so judges and lawyers have what are called continuing legal education opportunities, and they're starting to be taught, about the potential downfalls, the potential negative sort of impacts of ML tools and other sort of tools. So I think it all depends on how judges and lawyers specifically are educated in these tools and what they're taught. So I would be concerned if they're being taught to sort of trust them. I think they should be taught to have a healthy bit of skepticism. And hopefully, yeah, if the public, it would be problematic if the public came to lessen their skepticism about these tools, because I think we should always be mindful and also always assessing how these tools are used and how much trust are being given, and how the human in the loop, which is often discussed in these discussed as a potential way of mitigating the potential harms of ML algorithms, is introducing this human in the loop dynamic. But I'm skeptical of that framework given, like, well, we had to account for the human. We had to account for what sort of humans are being put in the loop here. And so that's all to say, yeah, it would be worrisome if the public lessened its skepticism, because if they tend to accept it, then they may go unchecked, and I think that's problematic.
Regarding these algorithms for judges, it makes me think of Jessica Morley's talk yesterday regarding algorithms for physicians.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of inclined to suggest a similar kind of three-part question or response to that, right? So there's a factual question.
Mm-hmm.
Are these algorithms more accurate than humans without algorithms, or than humans plus algorithms, right? So you could do, and I'm sure this has been done to some extent, probably with various degrees of quality, where you could certainly, at least in principle, construct an experiment where you have judges reaching decisions about, say, sentencing, and then you have them do it with or without these guidelines, and then you compare the quality of sentencing, say its consistency, say it's whether it meets certain standards, or you have some kind of independent panel of very experienced judges who together evaluate how effective the sentencing is. So you have the factual question of whether at some point the algorithms might become better than your average judge at determining sentences. And then if that becomes the case, then you then face this normative, you might just say, okay, well, then we should have the algorithms do it. But then there are at least two further kind of normative issues, right? One would be whether there's some kind of non-utilitarian benefit in having a human do it. Or whether maybe even if the sentences are on average better, right? Maybe there's less bias against the most disadvantaged or something like that if a human does it, or maybe it's the reverse, right?
Yeah.
And then you could also have long-term consequential, the third prong of this is you could have long-term consequences, right? So even if the sentences are better, case by case, it could be that the judges de-learn some of their epistemic skills or something like that. And so there would be long-term consequences to look out for. I don't know. So that's just kind of a comment or a thought that I wanted to invite you to expand on.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. So this is actually the subject of the paper that, again, Syed and I have been working on, is that one non-consequential concern that we might have is, so we want our judges to be skillful reasoners. We think they should be skillful reasoners. They should develop certain aptitudes, certain epistemic, maybe we'll call them epistemic virtues. And the continual use of RAIs or other sort of tools may prevent or impede the development of these skills. So even if, and so there's that. There's sort of the kind of response to that. And then the factual case, I think as maybe Jessica may have mentioned yesterday, how we determine, it's not quite clear to me from the literature how accuracy is determined here. Because it's, at least in the case of the RAIs used by judges, they're often trained with only half of the information, or only partial bit of the information that we would think it should be. So it doesn't take into sort of like counterfactual information. So it only takes into account information about those who previously have been unreleased, so or have been sort of sentenced. So it doesn't have any they're not trained on the information of those who were released. And so that seems to be information that should speak to the accuracy. And so, yeah, so that on the factual basis, it's that's sort of problematic topic.
So just quick mention, David, I think you got it reversed. So mostly the information they have is on the people that were released. The ones that didn't get released, they never get counted as what their likelihood would be for recidivism because they weren't released. But
Right.
Yeah, so maybe we could sort of separate the discussion a little bit, whether it's the educational section. So if I would be a coder, a senior coder, of course, using AI tools instead of sort of teaching juniors to get better and better and using their sort of not that great code in the beginning would be convenient for me. But sometimes I will be retired. And then if I never sort of had this interaction with juniors, then we would have no seniors anymore. And so in this educational sector, I would say your worry, your risk is really right. But if we can sort of separate it and take it as an aid for experts and still make the experts educate young people, why not? So if we can
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah, no, I think again, the sort of, for me, it's in the details of how we go about in doing so. Like it's again, this would be something that had to be carefully fleshed out, and yeah, we will have to experiment with how we use these tools, how we introduce them, how we uh, uh, educate folks in them, and how, because I think there's been at the moment there's some work being done in introducing these tools in the educational sector. Some here at the University of Kansas are looking into this very thing, especially in special education. And so, but yeah, I think it could be an aid. They could always be an aid. But again, the devil's in the details. We need to be mindful of the very, and I'm not necessarily say that we should be slow in how we roll these things out. I think, again, friend Ramon Alvarado says that we should kind of use them and use them often, and find how they work and how they don't work, and find ways of how to assess it, and how we assess these tools. So there's that, always that approach of going about and finding out how we should introduce these tools. So yeah, I think it's, again, these could be tools, these could be aids, but just how, and maybe so we don't, with the case of the judge, maybe we don't use them in as definitive or verdictive sort of instruments, but more as not necessarily guide rails either, but as sort of that thing that prompts us to think about our own decision, and that prompts us to reassess our own decision. It could be used maybe in that way, but not as sort of something that we take as being predictive, where we base our decision off of it.
I wonder if there's something like a right to be heard. So I kind of imagine an extreme case,
yeah,
where the AIs get, say, maybe proven to be fairer on average as adjudicators of sentence lengths or something like that than human judges. And so we kind of like take the judge out of the equation, and it just, you feed the info into the computer, and then the computer decides. And you might think, well, if that's fairer, that's better. But then part of me is thinking, maybe there's something kind of a non-utilitarian value in being heard by a judge, right? And just getting, somehow it's going through the judge's mind is some kind of important part of, say, being respected as a defendant. And you could dial that back away from the extreme case. You could say, well, if the judge is just relying too much on a tool and they're not really thinking for themselves, then you haven't really had your case heard in some full way that you're due, that kind of respects you as a defendant or something like that. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, so the EU is actually, I think it's in either in the AI Act or the GDPR, includes this right to a human decision. So it allows defendants, or even folks that are being subject to loan determinations, for a human decision. So people can opt out of being the subject of ML algorithm, and have a human be the assessor of their risk. I think the US may have included something like it in the recent AI Bill of Rights. But I know definitely the EU AI Act has something like a right to a human decision included in one of their framework for addressing the dangers of AI. And I support that. Yeah, I think that at least having that option is important.
So maybe there's another thing why it would be nicer to be sentenced by a human, because in a human, if I know it's a human, I at least can imagine that I could ask him for reasons. And so if an AI is criticizing my new book, I would imagine that would make me really angry, because I have no chance to sort of convince the AI from the opposite. But if a very stupid reviewer is criticizing my new book, I at least have this idea. I mean, sometimes it's useless, but I have the idea that I could sort of start an interaction where reason giving is at least part of it.
Yeah.
And so if you get a wrong sentence from a human, you have the idea you can sort of do something about it. And if you have the AI tool speaking the right, what should you do?
Yeah, so one of the ways that I like to frame the nature of judicial decision making is that it's in part a epistemic enterprise, but it's also a justificatory enterprise. So it's one where judges should have reasons for the determinations or for their decisions. They don't always right now. There's like nothing that requires them to share their reasoning. But if they're challenged, they obviously have to share how they arrived at their decision. So yeah, this is an issue in part about opacity. But there was a case, I think, in Wisconsin where a defendant challenged the determinations of the compass, which is one of the common tools used in the United States. And basically, the court said the only thing that the defendant could challenge the algorithm on, or this risk assessment tool on, is the information that the defendant themselves entered. So they were very limited in terms of how they could challenge the determination made by these tools. And that seems unjust. That seems to be like even if with imperfect reasoning by judges, we at least have the opportunity to challenge them in substantive ways. That seems to not be the case with the use of algorithms. So one thing I like to point out is that it's not clear what sort of reasons this ML algorithm is able to provide. And so given that, it doesn't seem something that we want to introduce generally, but so that's the stronger claim, I guess, is that generally in this process, given that the trial court and judicial decision making is a justificatory enterprise, so and given that ML algorithms themselves can't really provide us with reasons, and again that may change at some point, but at the moment they don't, and it's not quite clear that the judge can say that its determinations acts as a sort of reason for their own decision. It's not quite clear to me that it itself acts as a sort of potential reason for a judge to incorporate into their decision. So given those reasons, it's not clear to me that using them generally even is something that we should allow for.
All right, David, thank you so much.